The quick answer is yes.
Sir, yes, sir!
Memory palaces absolutely do work.
Yes!
But there's a catch. There's always a catch. Whether you're using memory palaces from Charles Dickens' England, or every memory palace from every museum listed in this book, or heck, maybe you're even using for your memory palaces now open on Sundays as a sign in the streets, the reality is that the memory palace technique always requires a bit of setup. And that shouldn't be a problem. I mean, if you're gonna go skiing, you got to put on skis, and if you're going to play hockey, you got to put on skates, etc. But how much setup depends for you when it comes to the memory palace technique on where you currently find yourself in life. And for some people, mastery of the memory palace technique takes an incredibly short period of time. In other cases, I've seen students try to learn the technique in bits and pieces. They put off the most important exercises you have to complete or the steps that you have to follow, etc. And as a result, it's taken longer than necessary. But people who persist, they get there anyway. And I've got many, many cases where I can show you how that has switched on eventually. But it doesn't have to take eventually for you to get it right, because you may simply just need to be convinced by the science. But there's even a catch on top of that. You know, it may be the case that you do not want to use memory palaces at all. Oh yes, I said it. Perhaps the internet's most dedicated memory palace master of just loving one technique and talking about it over and over again. I acknowledge that the memory palace might not be the right place for you to start, which is why today I'm going to share with you a little bit later on a new starter kit that will help you determine the best possible starting spot for memory techniques for you, because it might just be the case that the memory palace is not the right place to start. However, once you see the evidence, what it means for different kinds of people, you may be encouraged to finally just dive into the memory palace technique, because there's another catch. And it really just leads to how you think about the nature of the information that you need to commit to memory. And we want to have one word in our minds above all, and that word is experiment. People sometimes never understand these techniques because they want to know what it's all about in advance. And you can't, as far as I know. You have to experiment, even if you do feel like you understand it conceptually. And that's why what we're going to do today should help you start experimenting with all the memory techniques in the best possible ways that the evidence has revealed, because the evidence does stand in favor of the technique. Now, there are a couple of things that I'll share that reveal ways that it hasn't worked, and I'll explain why that I think that in certain circumstances it doesn't work some of the time. And that's going to be information that gets you even more closely and tightly involved with thousands of years of tradition, more science than anyone has time to read, which is why I have picked out some of the most important parts, and decades of memory competition records. Even I set a record of sorts when I competed, and it was great because I didn't fall flat on my face. I was able to prove the concept about what I can do under pressure in competition settings. But when it comes to the science, it's so exciting when you really start to think about what it is and how it works. And this idea of studying not just memory, but retention, recall, really switches on in 1885. And I'm very, very inspired by the guy that we're going to talk about today, who kicked off this idea of studying retention itself. So, do memory palaces work? This is the essential evidence for you today, but we've got to note that the memory palace technique goes back thousands of years, earlier even than the method of loci that you see discussed in the Greek and the Latin training manuals. I have one of these training manuals here. It's amazing, this bilingual edition. It's in Rhetorica ad Rheneum, and all of these things are true, and they pass through history to us today because they're true, but it was Hermann Ebbinghaus who first codified why the technique of the memory palace works. So you want to look at his 1885 book. In German, it's Über das Gedächtnis, and in English, Memory, A Contribution to Experimental Psychology. And because of what Ebbinghaus did in those experiments, I think he called them sinnlose Silben, something like that. He memorized these nonsense syllables, we would say, in English. And he derived these terms like primacy effect, recency effect, and serial positioning effect that helped us understand a memory strategy called spaced repetition. And spaced repetition, it describes a very, very specific review pattern that you can use to overcome what Ebbinghaus called the forgetting curve. And the forgetting curve in his n=1 experiments showed that we lose 50 to 80% of information at a very steady rate unless we review that information. So there's lots of ways to do spaced repetition. You can use index cards, you can use software, etc. But the memory palace technique is one of the most refined ways to defeat the forgetting curve. And in studies, we have seen up to 93 or 88% retention, depending on what the study is, compared to 44%, 28%, etc. in rote learning. So if you really want to get into this, please just understand that the studies show that it's not just the memory palace technique on its own. It's how the memory palace technique is used in combination with the principles of spaced repetition that Hermann Ebbinghaus helped us bring forward. And then you can use that knowledge to retain just about anything, including abstract information, including even shapes. You can even use shapes themselves at an abstract level as a memory palace, which I've talked about on this channel before. And so if you want to see that kind of content that I've talked about before, make sure that you smash that thumbs up, get subscribed if you're new here, and enable those notifications, because one of the next videos I have is going to be about how self-taught geniuses operated, how they ticked. And I'm talking about people like Leonardo da Vinci. And I will have this book read very shortly and help you understand that he was an autodidact. He taught himself in so many ways. And you're going to be excited and amazed by how you don't have to have fancy degrees or anything like that. I mean, I happen to have some fancy degrees, but at the end of the day, it's not necessary in order to unlock the curiosity and the critical thinking that will lead you to extraordinary memory, extraordinary learning, extraordinary retention, and accomplishment in this life. Please don't miss it. All right, so one of the studies that I want to highlight beyond Hermann Ebbinghaus is Gordon H. Bauer's, it was called Analysis of a Mnemonic Device. And the mnemonic device that he's talking about is the memory palace. And so, I don't know, between Ebbinghaus and 1960, or the 60s in general, there wasn't a whole lot of study of memory that's all that interesting. There's a guy named Richard Zeman that I'm quite interested in that I'll talk about in the future, but I haven't found that much that touches upon the classic memory palace technique. And partly that's just simply because the proof is already abundant in how that people have passed on the technique over and over and over again. But the scientists were also pouring a lot of attention towards topic like subliminals and whatnot. And I have a video about subliminals for memory and a podcast about it if you haven't seen that, if you want to know about subconscious influence and all that sort of stuff. But a lot of attention, I think, went to that area of the mind, and memory in terms of the memory palace went away. But in 1970, Gordon Bauer published this analysis of a mnemonic device, and he returned attention to the ancient memory palace technique, and he asked a lot of really interesting questions about it. And he has these really fascinating illustrations that were placed in an American Scientist article, and he showed how the device works. And one of the most fun of the illustrations is tomatoes splattered on the door of a home. And he said, a person would imagine such a scene to help themselves remember, say, tomatoes on their shopping list. He doesn't say it in those words, but, that's the idea. And so this is a quote from him. Actually, he says what the user would do is ask, what was happening to the door? And then the scene would bring back the target information. And further, he says, the loci on the list are well learned and are easily recalled to mind. Recall of the scene constructed at each locus enables him to recognize and name the other object in it. So he's using this technical term loci, which is for the method of loci. Loci is the singular for locus. Yeah, I think that's right. And so each individual station in a memory palace, like the door, is a loci, and the method of loci is assigning all of these individual stations and then adding associations that help you remember. So on the door, you would have tomato, and on the porch, you would have potatoes, and that would remind you to buy tomatoes and then potatoes if you're going shopping. Now, Bauer is exactly right about this idea that you are using something that you've already learned. That's very, very important. Now, you can certainly use imaginary and virtual memory palaces, but you wind up adding an additional cognitive load that technically isn't necessary. And one of the interesting periods in history when people get the idea that using virtual memory palaces or imaginary memory palaces is just tickety-boo comes from a mistake in interpreting Robert Flood. And Robert Flood shows images of memory palaces, especially images of theaters. And he's talking about using theaters as memory palaces. And people got the idea, oh, you just make these things up, especially since he places these geometrical images in his theaters. But that's not what he's saying. And if you read him closely, he's talking about using your memory of the theaters that you go to see plays. And yes, you can add these little geometrical shapes that will help you use memory palaces in particular ways. But no, he's not talking about adding additional cognitive load. Throughout this book, he's saying reduce cognitive load over and over and over again, including with the images that you place inside of them to make the associations. So what that means is, yeah, you might throw tomatoes at a door, but could you make it a specific tomato? And that might be a little bit challenging, but it is part of the principle. And I would, for example, make it tomatoes in the hands of Tom Cruise. Tomato has T-O-M, Tom Cruise has T-O-M, and now he's throwing the tomatoes at the door, and it's just power upon power upon power. And notice that it's power without force, because it's using that T-O-M as its basis. Okay, so in terms of scientific evidence about how all this works, Bauer was producing his analysis of a mnemonic device at a time when neurological evidence was quite slim. Nonetheless, he used the memory science that he had on hand to hypothesize that part of the memory palace technique's success boiled down to what he thought was left hemisphere brain activity and the verbal ability of the user. So, this is very interesting that he talks about verbal ability because I think this is true. Some years ago, Richard Rubin, not to be mistaken with Rick Rubin, the record producer, he was on the Magnetic Memory Method podcast, and he was talking about a problem in phonetics and people not having been taught phonetics and having struggles with memory techniques. And I thought, that's very, very puzzling. And he said, yeah, you got to listen to this podcast called Soul to Story. And it talks about how really an entire generation, if not more than one generation of people, did not learn reading through phonetics. And it totally makes sense that they would struggle to think, okay, so let me think here. You're going to have your friend Trevor's house, and you're going to have Tom Cruise throwing tomatoes at his door to help you remember tomatoes more specifically, because Trevor starts with T, tomato starts with T, Tom Cruise starts with T, etc. They're having a hard time with this. And I don't know why all of a sudden people started having a hard time with this, but that theory that not being taught phonetics while you're learning to read and how it has robbed people of a joy of reading, robbed them of a joy of linguistic play and association, it makes sense why some people are struggling. All the more reason to make sure you get that special resource I have for you for alternatives to the memory palace so you can start to restore that love of phonetics, because it is part of the puzzle here. And this initial research from the 70s already dialed in on it as being part of the mix. Isn't that fascinating? It's amazing to me, and I'm so glad that I have the passion to read some of this science, because quite frankly, it's not the easiest stuff to read, but that's why I'm here. And thanks to everybody for supporting it. Thumbs up, subscribe, all that jazz. Next up is Roots to Remembering by Ellen McGuire and her team. So the memory palace technique is all about assigning memory spaces for whatever it is that you want to learn. Typically, with a route involved, or what's sometimes called the journey method, which is an alternative for memory palace technique or the method of loci, etc. Now, along with her team, Eleanor McGuire, who unfortunately passed away quite recently, she just cut to the chase on this point. And the Nature article they published, as I mentioned, is called Routes to Remembering, the brain behind superior memory. To conduct this study, the researchers enlisted 8 memory champions, and memory champions use memory palaces. So we already have all the evidence that we need that these techniques work. It's just a question of getting it working for you. And now we have some brain imaging because these researchers were able to scan the brain, and they determined that people who had developed superior memory skills, not born with it, not magically gifted with it out of the sky, but developed these skills, they showed specific differences in the brain. And the test examined the mental athletes in some interesting ways. Numbers, faces, and even snowflakes, which I think is quite interesting because these are shapes that are both abstract and concrete at the same time, but difficult to tell the differences between them. But with all 3 information types, the reason for the benefits was clear. It's that the memory champions had well-practiced spatial memories. How did they get that? Well, by using the memory palace technique, of course. How else? So this is just unquestionable evidence that I've seen play out in my own life anecdotally. I've seen it with my students many, many times, but it gets better because some people, including Eric Legge and his team, have asked, what about making memory palaces very, very quickly? And this is important because a lot of people worry, this just takes too long to develop memory palaces. Now, I don't think that's true. I think that they just have incomplete training. If you're spending more than 2 to 5 minutes on your memory palaces, you just need to go and study the techniques a little bit better because you don't have to spend any longer than that. I've talked about that on this channel many times before. But scientists have asked this question, and in building a memory palace within minutes, Eric Legge and his team created a virtual environment and tested it against traditional memory palaces. And the researchers found that although their artificial memory palaces worked, they actually didn't improve anyone's results. It was more or less the same, or at least this is how I interpret the research. And so if you're not going to get any better result from using a virtual memory palace, you're better off sketching your own memory palace based on locations that you're familiar with. Now listen, please. I do mean a sketch. I don't mean being artistic. I don't mean learning to draw, although that would be a very good thing to do. And I have learned some of the formulas that Da Vinci talks about, and we'll talk about that in my next video when we get to it. But at the end of the day, what we're going to have to understand is that a memory palace drawn on a simple index card will maximize the value because you're getting your hand involved. And I have so many memory palaces that work so much better because I've drawn them. Now, how do I know that they work better? Because when I go in solo and cold without drawing my memory palaces, I suffer. And that suffering is unnecessary. Okay, this is really, really important as well. There's a difference between a true memory palace and a memorized palace. So if you have to learn a memory palace, whether it's a virtual one or it's a picture in a book or it's a video game, video games might be an exception to the rule, but nonetheless, you're still learning it purposely in a way that is different than if you just go into real locations and you don't even have to pay attention to them to learn them. That's what a true memory palace is you use what you just know, what's in your memory. Not what you have to stretch for, not what you have to grunt after, but what's just there. So as the McGuire research suggests about routes to remembering, if you can just harness the power of the spatial memory you have for the locations that you've automatically learned based on what's called implicit memory, well, that's what's going to make the biggest difference. And some people are just going to have to train in order to do that. They're going to have to practice. How? By just drawing a lot of memory palaces. And I have exercises for that thousands of people have seen, over 100,000 people. And I have so many of their drawings and so many people saying, thank you for taking me through this exercise because it has helped trigger my memory of other locations. Now, why would that be? It's because once you start doing it, you're in the practice. and the practice will reveal itself to you. Action reveals what stasis conceals. And if you want to spend time memorizing locations, have at it. There's nothing wrong with it per se. But it might actually lead you away from the discipline, which is to actually exercise your memory and use what's in your memory so that you might remember more of what's in your memory. I know I sound a little bit orthodox and, oh yes, but it's only coming from the love of what I've seen it do for people who break out of their prisons and actually go to the real place to do the real thing. Now, one of the most exciting areas of research in memory palace science is medical student research, because I love working with medical students. In fact, as we speak right now, Ivar and I, one of my favorite students, he was a nursing student who wanted to add, he wanted to become an anesthetist on top of like a nursing anesthetist. So we got together and we recorded a bunch of his memory palaces and his various ways of studying anesthesiology. And wow, I still remember some of the stuff that we were talking about, like the nodes of Ranvier in the brain. And it's just wonderful because even when I'm not doing it, I still remember it by going through it with him. Anyway, I'm uploading some of those recordings privately, exclusively in the Magnetic Memory Method Masterclass because there's just a beautiful level of thinking that Ivar brings. And he did pass that exam that we recorded these examples for. But it's not just about him and his anecdotal example and me being able to remember the nodes of Ranvier and thoracic cavities and all this sort of stuff. It's also about the researchers at, for example, Monash University. They tested memory palaces against a Aboriginal version of memory palaces with some medical students. Both of these head researchers appeared on the Magnetic Memory Method podcast to discuss the study, and you can still find both those interviews either by audio on the Magnetic Memory Method podcast or here on my YouTube channel with Drs. David Reeser and Tyson Yonkaporta. They share their interpretations of the results. They actually have two different conclusions about it, and I think the one with Tyson Yonkaporta is a little bit more revelatory about what's really going on. And the study itself is well worth reading. And, you should read these studies on your own because I'm only human. Maybe I have a bias and I read them the way that I want to. But don't worry, I will share some that go against my preciously held convictions in a minute. The point is that the research does demonstrate this. And the Monash University study is quite interesting because of the split test between the, so to speak, standard memory palace and an Aboriginal variation on it. But there's many, many other studies to pick from. There are pharmacology retention studies about memory palaces. There's at least one endocrinology study that shows those kinds of students benefiting from the memory palace technique. There's really interesting study about dermatology students using memory palaces. And in that case, they had a VR memory palace, virtual reality. And you can find this in the journal from the Academy of Dermatology. And one point is really, really interesting from that study. And it's something that you also find in the Monash University split test between Aboriginal and traditional memory palaces. The researchers there supplied the participants not just the memory palaces, but also some of the mnemonic associations or the mnemonic images. And this feature of their research raises a very, very interesting question, because I always argue you're much better off coming up with your own imagery, or not even that, identifying the imagery already in your mind. And that's why I give particular exercises, so that you start on the basis of what you have to strengthen your memory for what it already is. Rather than going and memorizing a bunch of images, which is totally unnecessary, you build on the foundation of who you already are. And that is the question. Has anybody studied the difference between memory palace locations that people give you versus the ones that you develop on your own? And the answer is yes. And it's basically accuracy in a virtual memory palace. I think it was called John Paul Huntner. And he is not just a solo researcher, like as in many of these studies, but just for the sake of brevity, I know I'm not a very brief person, but I try. I'm not naming every single person who was involved in all these studies. But they were evaluating the accuracy that students had when they were using virtual memory palaces. And we're getting a little bit into the weeds of mnemonic techniques here, but these researchers report that participants who used a pre-designed memory palace showed better results. And in this study, they were given the mnemonic images. Now, the problem is, because I have to problematize it, even though it somewhat speaks against my own theories, is that it's an artificial environment, right? This study, and there's another study called Virtual Memory Palaces, Immersion Aids Recall, they involve participants memorizing information of limited importance when you think about it, right? And it's also just people who are in a laboratory setting in many cases. But let's look at the ones that really have super limited importance. So do you recognize people here? I mean, I'll give you a second. I'll just have some mumbo-jumbo mumbling while you take a look. I recognize them, and I'll name them now that you've had a chance. Oprah, Napoleon, Shrek, Martin Luther King, Stephen Hawking. Well, what the heck are they doing in a study about virtual memory palaces? These are such famous faces. I'm not convinced that the memory palace is being tested at all in this particular experiment, right? At least the Monash University study, it used challenging information, and it was information related to anatomy, right? So that's really, really important. And in the one with the virtual memory palaces for dermatology, they're a little bit more on the nail, but they're still supplying things in an artificial environment. And I don't know the extent to which those people were motivated to pass exams, whether they thought this was going to help them pass their exams, etc. But one thing that I have found is that a lot of people, they struggle with memory palaces for exams, not because of the memory palace technique, but because they're taking the exams for the wrong reasons. They're not really in love with the outcome. They want a job. They're being pressed by their parents to get a particular job, whatever the case may be. And so they're actually looking for a shortcut, and they don't care about what they're doing. They just want to get it done. Now, I'm not casting any shade on people in that situation. I've been in that situation myself. But at the end of the day, when we have these scientific studies, they do not tell us about real life. So I'm very glad that researchers have tested virtual memory palaces and shown an effect. But to then say that, oh, well, we can use virtual memory palaces and it's better, or it's better for me at an anecdotal level and so forth, we just need much more robust studies before accepting the argument that virtual memory palaces are better than traditional memory palaces. One point, though, that I have to make for anybody doubting that memory palaces work is that they work. And the studies just show that they work. They show that the traditional memory palace works. They show that the virtual memory palace works. And I am just making the claim that for a lot of us, traditional memory palaces based on what's already in your memory is going to help you deal with the technique much better because it's going to reduce cognitive load. Whereas if you have to learn memory palaces, you're going to increase cognitive load. And I don't know how that you cannot increase cognitive load when you have to memorize a virtual environment at the same time that you're memorizing what's in it. And if you're going to have Oprah in there, that information and the order of those people almost comes free because it's just Oprah and Stephen Hawking. I mean, come on. But in any case, Napoleon, I'm sorry if you're just more memorable than, I don't know, the scaphoid of your carpal bone series, right? As opposed to the lunate and the capitate and all that sort of stuff. Like, lunate and capitate is what I would want to see studied there and placed in that memory palace. And I'll bet any money if we did a split test against that with proper memory training, we would have better results for those actual terms than we would from just bizarre celebrities that everybody knows. Another element that we have to acknowledge and think about when we're talking about scientific studies is that it's sometimes one study against another. So in active learning or active recall studies, we have a focus on the importance of personalization in learning. So when I talk about using the memory palace technique in particular ways, or indeed when Robert Flood does, because I'm not alone in this orthodox, come on, let's do the real deal kind of attitude, we have to think about what the active recall studies tell us. If you personalize what you're doing, you're going to remember it better. So using actual locations you visited is already more personal. Using Tom Cruise, if you've seen Tom Cruise movies, is going to be a lot more active and personal than just the abstract idea or the generic idea of a tomato. That seems to me just common sense logic, but it's also in the active recall, active learning evidence. All right, so what about some case studies, examples, etc.?
Hey everybody, so I'm here in the Atlanta airport. I was just thinking about how grateful and thankful I am for what Anthony did for me. I do seminars all across the country, usually have about 100 to 300 people every single weekend, and one of my biggest goals was to be able to memorize their names, and started studying some stuff and learning, and it wasn't connecting as fast as it needed to, and I just wasn't connecting the dots, and started doing some research online, and there I found Anthony. And Anthony, I just want to tell you thank you very much for all that you've done. Now, man, my memorization is through the roof. I've almost reached my goal of getting 300 people at one time. I'm not exactly there yet. I'm off just by a few, but I'll get there as I keep practicing and keep connecting what I've learned from you and what you've put and you've helped me with. And so I just want to tell everybody, if you're looking to take your memory palaces and your memory techniques to the next level, I mean, Anthony's the guy.
I have countless testimonials. I think I have one of the longest testimonial walls for the Magnetic Memory Method Masterclass in all of memory training. Maybe there are others, I don't know, but it's so long and I haven't even added some of the new stuff that's come in just this year. But at the end of the day, and sorry, by the way, if I've dallied and you've sent me one, I don't know if you've noticed, but things are pretty chaotic right now. But thank you for your patience if it hasn't appeared yet. But we often hear about people with memory competition results and so forth. That's amazing. I always love how John Graham, 3 times USA memory champion, talked about how I was like a mentor for him. That's such a huge honor. I mean, he did the work. But at the end of the day, the memory athletes inspire us. People like Joshua Foer write books like Moonwalking with Einstein and so forth. Others contribute new variations on old techniques like Dominic O'Brien did with the Dominic system and Lance Shart with the shadow, on and on and on, right? There's all kinds of memory palace experts out there who are expanding their teaching. Tony Buzan added in the mind map mastery and so forth. Like the examples go on and on and on and on and on. And even my own favorite accomplishments and the things that I've done for students, they have a common denominator. Everybody has a common denominator. It's experimenting. It's being willing to experiment. But sometimes it's hard to get yourself to do so. So I'll never forget Robert Spraggs. He was emailing me back and forth. He's like, I really don't believe how this is going to happen. I can't get it. I keep thinking about it. And it's just like, this is an overwhelming amount of information. How is the memory palace technique going to scale? I don't feel creative and all this sort of stuff. Beautiful. He was willing to at least talk about it. And I was able to show him that the memory palace technique does scale if you use it in particular ways. And you don't have to come up with lots of associations. You just have to understand the theory and use the techniques correctly. And I ain't alone, because this is one of the books back in the day that was pushing this truth about the techniques. So push comes to shove. Robert Spraggs says, all right, I'll take you at your word. I will experiment. And it was hard for him. Even though he's a science student in neuroanatomy, it was hard for him to get himself to experiment. But he did. And he beat everybody in that class. His class average was phenomenally higher than the average of the other students. His scores were phenomenally higher than what the other students got, and he was very gracious enough to share those results with us so that we can be inspired. But you have to be inspired by the correct thing. His scores after taking the Magnetic Memory Method Masterclass, they're something that you will get if you also do what he did, right? And it's the same thing for me. I remember when I first was thinking about applying the Magnetic Memory Method to Mandarin, I was like, oh my goodness, is this really going to work with all those characters? And is it going to work with the tones and all that sort of stuff? And I have to say, my tones are far from perfect and so forth. And I don't know all that many characters, but I still passed level 3 in Mandarin. And I was especially pleased by the results because, I'm not that old, but I ain't that young either anymore. The classes started at 6 p.m. I'm a guy who gets up at 4 a.m. almost every morning, so that's quite late in the day for me. That's when the final test took place at 6 p.m. But nonetheless, I aced it. And why? Because I was willing to experiment. I had my own doubts about the exact way that I use the techniques. And speaking about mind mapping and Tony Buzan, I got some mind mapping into the mix. And it was amazing because I thought, I've got to figure out a way to make this scale for all these characters. So I experimented. And that's the thing that is the common denominator. No matter what book you read, no matter who is teaching it, I've seen it happen again and again and again, including with my own students. If you get in there and you treat it like an experiment, it will work for you, or at the very least, you will learn something about the nature of experimentation. And then maybe a year or two, you'll come back later and it'll finally make sense to you. Kevin Richardson, that was his name. He took the Magnetic Memory Method Masterclass. He was just like, I don't get it. Then he decided to come back 2 years later. Bang, presto, the next thing you know, he's just loving it with Japanese, and his Japanese proficiency started to soar, and he came on the Magnetic Memory Method Masterclass to talk about it. So, from my experience as someone who has been using these techniques personally for decades, I gave a TEDx talk that I didn't actually really ever pursue. I was asked to do it, and then I said, okay, I will do it to give me opportunity to strut my stuff a little bit. I'm not really a demonstrator, and I don't feel like I need to demonstrate because the scientific proof is there. Thousands of years of tradition is there. All the memory competitors and their results are there. So what was I going to add by chanting Sanskrit on a TEDx talk? Well, apparently it added a lot because it got millions of views and it inspired lots of people, and a lot of people went on to read The Victorious Mind, etc., which is basically what I just memorized a bit of the Victorious Mind and gave it on that TEDx stage. But I've always felt that this is just a very private practice for me, and to go in there and be like, oh, memorize this, memorize that. I've come to learn that that's what the world needs. So I give more demonstrations. But at the end of the day, the evidence, even if I gave never once a demonstration, is in my favor, because this isn't about me, and it isn't about you either. It's about a tradition, in the same way that martial arts are not about Bruce Lee. But why was Bruce Lee so successful? Because he didn't make it about this or that name or label or word. He made it about the process, about getting in to the field and practicing on the basis of what practice is. So I said that there's an alternative to the Memory Palace, but there is a catch. I'll talk about that catch in a minute. But it is the Mnemonic Devices Starter Kit. If you would like to claim that, I'll give you the link, etc., in a second. But what I want you to understand is that the catch is that all information is spatial. So the idea that we're ever getting away from the Memory Palace technique, maybe this is just a quirk of mine, but I can't see how the letter A is not special. And we have to memorize words, many of which have the letter A in it. And so we can use the letter A as a Memory Palace. We can use the spatial features of it. When we place associations inside of Memory Palace as well, those associations are spatial. So Harry Lorraine, for example, used to say that linking is superior to the Memory Palace. I always thought that was just the weirdest thing. I called him on it too. And basically what he said to me was, Anthony, whatever you do, don't tell them about the science. Don't tell them all this complicated stuff, right? Like, he knew that he was using Memory Palace techniques, but he thought it was too hard for people, I guess. And I've talked in my Rest in Peace video for him, and I showed you video footage of him using the Memory Palace technique before our very eyes. One of his teachings is to place weird images on people's faces. If that isn't the Memory Palace technique, I don't know what is. So there is, in my mind, no alternative at the end of the day, but you can come at it from different angles and then later come to see how they are spatial. So if you want the Mnemonic Devices Starter Kit, I will take you through every mnemonic device under the sun that I'm aware of at magneticmemorymethod.com/MDSK. That stands for Mnemonic Devices Starter Kit. And I want you to please understand that you have to experiment with them, whether you use linking or you use the story method or you use whatever you want to call these things, because people come up with new names all the time. You've got to accept the need to experiment, because I don't think there's an exception to that rule. I don't think anybody can get into these techniques without not a leap of faith, but a willingness to go in and do the real thing in the real place. And the real place is your mind. Now, I learned from the ancient masters like Robert Flood and Giordano Bruno, and you can call me old-fashioned, and you can call me a little bit orthodox and a little bit stubborn and all that sort of stuff, but the reality is that so many people out there on the market are in such a rush to make a buck that they dumb everything down. And again, Harry Lorraine, don't tell them about the science, whatever you do. Well, I made a career out of doing just that, because the science is the key to how I improved my own practice. It gave me ideas like never before. And quite frankly, a lot of that science is boring to read. But if you find yourself stuck with the Mnemonic Devices Starter Kit still, and you want to learn and you want to get out of that rut, I have a whole list of books on learning that make the scientific principles behind memory and learning available for you. It has the real deal. Read those books thoroughly. Spend at least 90 days to help yourself understand these things so that you have a shot at getting yourself out of the rut. And you will find yourself eventually applying the techniques to what you study in a way that will get you out of the prison of not implementing, not experimenting. And then you can come back to this and go, man, that guy was talking about well-formed memory palaces that you can build in 2 to 5 minutes or less, and everything's going to open up. So go and grab that Mnemonic Devices Starter Kit. And if you truly are still stuck, also stick around, come back and watch. There's a link here, or if you're listening to the podcast, search for it. Watch or listen to my material on books on learning next. And this will teach you about a wide range of memory techniques, so you don't have to start with memory palaces if you don't want to. Just remember the catch, because there's always a catch. I will eventually, or I will at least not stop trying to convince you that all information is spatial. And where else would it be except for in the space of your head? Megaston topos hapantagar kori. As Thales once said, space is ultimate because it contains all things, including the proof that memory palaces work. But the proof is in your practice, which is also in your head. So with that in mind, thanks everybody for those thumbs up, for getting subscribed, for all your wonderful comments. And until we have a chance to speak again, keep yourself magnetic.